I invite you to travel with me backwards in time. First, we're going to travel the 2023 years from now until the beginning of the Common Era, which is formerly known as AD. Then we're going to continue traveling backwards into what is now known as before the Common Era, traditionally known as BC. We're going to continue 1,600 years backwards into BCE. We're going to cross the Atlantic Ocean into what is now today the Middle East to northern Africa, the country of Egypt, to be precise. And as we swoop down in over the Nile River, we're going to see astounding construction projects underway. Huge pyramids, the Sphinx, palatial buildings, giant statues. Interestingly, we're going to see slaves that are making those buildings whipped into obedience by their masters. What I'm talking about is the historical context of the book of Exodus. It's the second book of the Hebrew Bible, and today we're beginning a devotional series through the book of Exodus. Exodus is actually a Greek word. It might surprise you, considering the fact that it's from the Hebrew Bible, but the Hebrew name of the book is actually Shemath. It means these are the names. It's kind of a strange name to title a book of the Bible until you start reading the first few words of the book of Exodus, which is, these are the names. And so the Hebrew title of the book is simply the first few words. We call it Exodus because in that word, we get a wonderful summary of the general overview of the contents of the book. Exodus in English, as in Greek, means a movement outward. Sometimes it can mean inward, but it really refers to this idea of an exit, exodus, moving out. When the translators of the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, gave it that name, it stuck. So the story of the book of Exodus is the story of the Israelite nation moving out of slavery in Egypt toward freedom in the promised land of Canaan. But maybe we should back up a little bit and remember how the nation even got to this place. Here's a super brief summary of the book of Exodus, the first book of the Bible. In Genesis, God creates the world, and then the people he created rebel. And so he floods the world, saving one faithful man and his family, Noah. They begin to repopulate the earth, and God reaches out to one of Noah's descendants, a man named Abram. And he calls him and his wife to move to the land of Canaan. Though Abram and his wife Sarai are old, they are way past childbearing years, God covenants with them to make their family into a great nation through whom he promises he's going to bless the whole world if they follow him. Well, it seems inconceivable, pun not really intended there, but Abram and Sarai obey. Along the way, they commit a series of blunders, and yet God keeps his promise. He changes their names to Abraham and Sarah and gives them a son, Isaac. Eventually, Isaac marries Rebekah, and they have twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob, the younger, pretty sneaky guy. The birthright, the blessing that was supposed to go to the oldest son, Jacob steals it. But God's covenant that he made with Abram, which he then passed on to Isaac, now passes to Jacob as well. In a dream, God restores Jacob after all the sneakiness and gives him a new name. It's the name Israel. So like his grandfather, Israel himself continues to have lots of hijinks in his process. He has multiple wives, and yet God blesses him with 12 sons. He's got a favorite, Joseph. And because Joseph's favorite, his other brothers detest him. They sell him into slavery. Joseph is eventually purchased by a powerful Egyptian. Through many years of faithful service and through a supernatural ability to interpret dreams, Joseph rises to become second in the nation of Egypt. Eventually, famine hits the area hard, and Joseph's brothers, who haven't seen or heard from him in a long time, travel to Egypt because they heard there was food there, and there was. Because of Joseph's wisdom and God's blessing on Joseph, Egypt is stocked with food. People from all over come to get grain, and there Joseph stuns his brothers, revealing himself to them, inviting them to move their father and the rest of the family to plenty and security in Egypt. And the family does just that. And there they thrive under the protection of Joseph. And that brings us to the book of Exodus. The traditional view states that Israel's great leader, Moses, we're going to meet him in just a moment, actually, in this devotional, is the author of the 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. There are definitely contemporary views that evaluate the language and the circumstances and structure of the books, and they believe them could be authored much, much later, even 1,000 years later during the time of Israel's exile. There's a lot of debate about even the veracity of the stories in Exodus. We cannot say for sure. And so this study is going to focus primarily on the details as presented in Exodus and what we can learn theologically from the stories and the laws that we will read. And that brings me to one more important point. Exodus tells the story of how God, flowing from this covenant that he originally made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, now further ratifies this covenant with their descendants, who are the 12 tribes of Israel. I recently preached through the book of Ezekiel. We also did a devotional study through the prophet Jeremiah. We learned very clearly through those 2 prophets that Israel broke the covenant between them and God. So God makes a new covenant. It's a covenant with his church mediated through the birth, the life, the death, and resurrection of Jesus in his sacrificial gift of love. In other words, we Christians, the church, we are not bound by the terms of that old covenant, that Mosaic law. We're bound by the terms of the new covenant. It's taught in the documents of the New Testament. So we don't have to follow the laws of the old covenant. But those laws have much to teach us. They teach us of the heart of God. That's how we can learn theological principles from every single one of them that we can apply to our lives now. And so, as we're going to be studying the story of Israel through the book of Exodus, we're going to be searching for those theological principles. So let's begin the search. Turn to Exodus chapter 1. In verses 1 through 10, we see that list of names that the Hebrew Shema talks about. These are the list of the 12 sons of Israel and their families who did move to Egypt. They grew into a great nation, and then as time went by, those generations of Joseph and his brothers pass away. And perhaps most importantly of all, we learn a new king comes to power. And that new king did not know Joseph. Maybe he knew of Joseph, but he did not honor Joseph the way the previous king did. Now in verse 14 of chapter 1, we learn that the Egyptian title for king is Pharaoh. And all this new Pharaoh can see is a threat, a liability, because Israel is growing and growing, and he's concerned that they may be a mighty nation who would throw in their lot with Egyptians' enemies. His solution is simple: slavery. In verses 11 through 14, we read that the Egyptians begin to oppress the Israelites, forcing them into labor, and over time, requiring them to do all the work to build cities for the Pharaoh. But here's the thing. The more the Egyptians oppress the Israelites, the more the Israelites multiply. Pharaoh's solution is not working like he intended, so he has to come up with a new one. And he goes even more extreme, moving from slavery to infanticide. In verses 15 through 22, Pharaoh commands the Hebrew midwives to kill all newborn baby boys. Well, the Hebrew midwives fear God. They refuse to obey Pharaoh, and they lie about it. And what happens is the Israelites multiply even further. Now Pharaoh doubles down. He says to his people that they all need to participate in the infanticide as well, making sure that all of the Israelites' baby boys are thrown into the Nile River. And then we continue into chapter 2. We move from this kind of wide-angle focus on the entire nation all the way down to one family. We learn that it is a family, an Israelite family from the tribe of Levi. That's one of Israel or Jacob's 12 sons. And this man marries a Levite woman. She becomes pregnant, and of course, it's a boy. The woman hides the baby for the first 3 months of its life, but she knows that this isn't going to last for long. She's not going to be able to keep this baby under wraps out of the watchful eyes of the Egyptians. And so she takes drastic action. She puts the baby in a waterproof basket and floats it onto the Nile River near the place where the Pharaoh's daughter bathes. She then asks her daughter, it would be the baby's older sister, to watch over the basket with the baby. Well, Pharaoh's daughter comes out to bathe and sees and hears the baby crying, and she feels sorry for the baby, even though he was a Hebrew boy. And just then, the baby's sister reveals herself and volunteers to get the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter thinks this is a great idea, with the intent that the baby will become the Pharaoh's daughters in time. She asks the baby's real mother to nurse the baby until he's old enough. She even pays the mother to do this. Imagine that, mothers, getting paid to nurse your own baby. And so, when the baby is old enough, the boy moves back into Pharaoh's daughter's home, and Pharaoh's daughter names him Moses. This is an extraordinary situation. This baby should have been killed, and yet he's saved. Both the Hebrew midwives and Pharaoh's own daughter disobey Pharaoh. We read that God honors their disobedience. So could we say that disobedience is the theological principle of the story? No. Instead, we read in chapter 1, verse 17, that the Hebrew wives feared God. That word fear carries the idea of honor. God honors those who honor him. Now, this reciprocal honor does not mean that God makes things perfect and easy for those who honor him. I mean, think about the story we're just reading. The Israelites are experiencing brutality and slavery and oppression, infanticide. What's astounding is that in the middle of all that horror, the Hebrew midwives honor God. They could have easily given up hope. They could assume that this so-called God of their long-gone ancestors had abandoned them or was impotent. That era of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that was a distant memory. And so maybe the stories of God's covenant with their forefathers was also a distant memory. Maybe for them it would make a lot more sense to start worshiping the Egyptian gods, because the Egyptians sure were powerful and wealthy. But no. The Hebrew midwives are faithful to Yahweh, the covenantal God of their ancestral family. They fear the Lord, they honor him, and so they choose an act of civil disobedience because Pharaoh was asking them to cross the line, to dishonor God, to murder. And the Hebrew midwives, they say no. They protect the baby boys. The Hebrew midwives are taking a massive risk in this act of civil disobedience. But if they got found out, they could have easily lost their lives. In fact, as I'm thinking about this, their lie to Pharaoh, this idea that the Hebrew women gave birth so fast that they couldn't get there in time, that's a super weak lie. That would never work in our day and age, I don't think. I mean, why didn't Pharaoh just say back to them, so what, go kill them now? Who cares how long it took? We don't know. I mean, there could have been a cultural, political dynamic at work there. Pharaoh, he is a politician. Maybe he didn't want to be known as a baby killer. That would not look good. Or He did kind of have a very good reason to keep the boys alive, despite his fears, and that was they were his workforce. But we don't know. We don't know why Pharaoh doesn't seem to follow through or test their lie. What we do know is the Hebrew midwives honor God, and God honors them. Now, I hope that you and I are never asked to kill babies for any government. Now, that might sound like abortion. This is different. This is involuntary, infanticide. It was forced. So it would not be interpreting the story correctly if we tried to make a connection to the contemporary abortion debate in our country. What we can see, however, and here is a bit of a connection, God is a God of life. He honors life. But it seems to me the best way to focus on the theological principle is to look at the idea that the Hebrew midwives feared God. And so what does that mean, to fear God in our days, hours, and minutes, wherever we are? Doesn't matter if we're at work, at school, home. Doesn't matter if it's in regard to our finances or our time, our play. Fearing God means that we want to honor God in all we do. As Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 10:31, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. To fear God, though, might take more than reading a story and having an intention to fear him. We might need accountability. We might need help. We might need people to surround us and support us and even ask us that question. Are you fearing God? How are you doing in your relationship with God? And so I encourage you to take time, listen to the Spirit, ask him to evaluate your life. Are you fearing God? Do you have that posture, that heart attitude that the Hebrew midwives had? And then surround yourself with people who can support you in that and encourage you in that. Thank you.